Chosen one, something has already shifted, and you felt it before you ever had proof. It was subtle at first, almost easy to dismiss, just a quiet awareness that someone's attention was resting on you in a way that felt different, heavier, more intentional. You tried to move past it, to stay grounded in your routine, to not read too deeply into something you couldn't fully see, but the feeling kept returning. That sense that something is happening behind the scenes, that someone is processing, studying, feeling something they don't yet understand how to express. This is not your imagination. This is confirmation. Because while you've been living your life with calm consistency, someone else has been unraveling in private, trying to make sense of the impact you've had on them without even trying. And recently, they reached a point where they couldn't keep it to themselves anymore. They sat down with someone they trust, and what came out was not polished, not controlled, but real. They admitted that they have never felt this way before, about anyone not like this, not this deep, not this consuming, and they don't know what to do with it. That is where this begins. Not with you chasing, not with you proving anything, but with someone else being moved so strongly by your presence that they had to speak it out loud just to understand it. So if something in you is already recognizing the truth of this message, if your spirit is quietly saying, "This explains what you've been sensing," take a moment right now to lock in with this energy, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment. I receive it because this message didn't find you by accident. It found you because something real is already in motion, and you are meant to be aware of it before it fully reveals itself. What makes this so significant, chosen one, is that this did not begin with bold action, dramatic pursuit, or some obvious declaration that anyone could point to and label right away. It began the way the deepest shifts usually begin, quietly, almost invisibly, in the private interior of someone who was fully expecting to remain in control of themselves. That is the part you need to understand first, because people often imagine that when feelings are real, they arrive loudly. They think real emotion always announces itself with clear signs, immediate words, some grand visible change. But some of the most life-altering feelings enter a person's world, like weather pressure before the storm, subtle at first, easy to explain away, easy to call coincidence, easy to dismiss as a passing curiosity. And that is exactly what happened here. This person did not want this to become anything. They did not wake up one morning hoping to be emotionally disrupted. They were not looking to be shaken out of their usual pattern. Their life had a rhythm to it, maybe not perfect, maybe not deeply fulfilled, but organized enough to feel manageable. They had their routines, their habits, their familiar emotional distances, their way of moving through the day without becoming too affected by anything or anyone. In a culture where so many people are exhausted, overbooked, and carrying invisible emotional weight from old disappointments, that kind of control can start to feel like safety. You get up, make the coffee, answer the texts you want to answer. Ignore the ones you do not go to work, smile when expected, scroll. When you are tired, drive home through the same intersections. Sit in the same parking lot for an extra minute before going inside and convince yourself that peace is the same thing as predictability. That is the kind of life this person had built for themselves. Functional, ordered, guarded. And then you entered the picture, and what they expected to remain casual refused to stay casual. At first, it was small enough for them to rationalize. Maybe it was the way you carried yourself. Maybe it was the steadiness in your voice. Maybe it was the strange fact that you did not seem to be performing for approval, the way so many people do now, trying to package themselves into something more digestible, more marketable, more easy to consume. You just were what you were. direct without being harsh, present without begging to be noticed, composed without looking cold. And for someone who has spent years around noise, that kind of presence can feel almost disorienting. It makes the room around it seem exaggerated. It reveals how much posturing, insecurity, and emotional clutter most people are carrying. This person noticed that. They may not have had language for it yet, but they noticed. The first time, they probably filed it away. Just a passing thought. Just a momentary awareness. Just one of those strange impressions people get sometimes. But then it happened again. Another interaction, another glance, another ordinary exchange that should have faded as quickly as it happened, except it did not. It stayed. It followed them. It came back later when it had no business being there. And that is where the resistance began, because the mind can tolerate a lot of things, but it becomes uneasy when something keeps returning without invitation. They tried to explain it in the safest terms possible. Maybe they just admired you. Maybe you just seemed different. Maybe it was just novelty, the psychological effect of meeting someone who doesn't fit neatly into the categories they usually rely on. That would have been convenient. That would have allowed them to keep their footing. But what they were experiencing refused to shrink into something manageable. You have to understand this chosen one because it says something powerful about the signal you carry. The reason they could not ignore what they felt is because what they felt was not built on fantasy. Fantasy is easier to dismiss. Fantasy depends on projection. It needs distance and illusion to survive. But this was not that. This was recognition colliding with resistance. This was someone encountering a presence that made them feel something real enough that their usual defenses could not file it away. And once that started happening, their inner life changed in ways they did not authorize. They would be doing something completely unrelated, something normal, something forgettable, and your image or your energy would surface in their mind again. Not because they were trying to summon it, not because they were indulging some secret obsession, just because you had lodged yourself somewhere deeper than surface thought. That is what unsettled them. It was not just that they thought about you, it was that they thought about you involuntarily. They were halfway through the workday, maybe looking at a spreadsheet, maybe walking out of a grocery store with bags cutting into their fingers, maybe standing in line at a gas station, maybe folding laundry with the television running in the background, and suddenly there you were in their mind again. Your face, your voice, your way of speaking, your energy, the specific quality of stillness you carry, the way you made them feel slightly more awake to themselves. They would sit with the thought longer than intended, and when they finally snapped back into the moment, they realized several minutes had passed. That is when dismissal started becoming impossible. Because when someone enters your mental space once, you can call it random. When they keep returning, especially in quiet, unguarded moments, it begins to feel like a message your own soul is trying to force you to read. This person did not like that feeling at first. Not because there was something wrong with what they felt, but because it threatened the illusion that they were still operating from a place of complete control. And many people, especially those who have been disappointed before, become deeply attached to that illusion. It is one of the most common emotional survival strategies in modern life. You keep yourself measured. You keep your investment low. You learn not to get too excited too soon. You tell yourself you are being wise when often what you are really being is protected. This person had their own version of that. Their own internal script. Their own polished way of not getting carried away. But your presence did something scripts cannot handle well. It made sincerity harder to avoid. It made them feel the gap between what they had been calling stability and what was actually just emotional management. And because that gap started opening, they tried even harder to explain you away. They may have told themselves that this was just temporary, that they were reacting to a mood, to timing, to loneliness, to curiosity. They may have compared you to other people and tried to reduce the difference. They may have deliberately kept their distance for a moment, hoping absence would settle whatever this was. But the opposite happened. Distance often clarifies what proximity first reveals. The more they tried to create internal distance from you, the more clearly they saw that something about you had already crossed into deeper territory. That is because what they were responding to was not just your appearance, not just your vibe, not just a shallow pull. They were responding to coherence. They were responding to the way your outer presence seemed to match something true beneath the surface. And in a world full of mixed signals, half-healed people, and constant emotional performance, coherence is rare enough to feel almost sacred when someone encounters it. It makes people stop. It makes them pay attention. It makes them ask themselves uncomfortable questions. Why does this person feel different? Why am I more aware around them? Why do I care what they think? Why do I feel seen by someone who has not even tried to pull me open? Those questions started building quietly inside them. And because they were not prepared for those questions, they did what many people do when the heart begins moving faster than the ego can organize. They resisted. Not publicly, not in a dramatic way, but privately, strategically, almost professionally. They tried to keep things neat. They tried to keep their responses normal. They tried not to linger too long, not to reveal too much, not to let their interest show in any way that would make them vulnerable before they had fully understood it themselves. And that is important, because when someone is trying very hard not to feel something and still cannot stop feeling it, that tells you the emotion has already passed the stage of being optional. That is what was happening here. This was no longer a matter of preference. This was becoming a matter of truth. They could act composed, but inside a shift had already begun. Every brief encounter with you was creating residue. That is the word for it. Residue. Something left behind after the moment itself had ended. A thought that would not fully resolve. A feeling that did not dissipate on schedule. A comparison that kept rising every time they encountered someone more predictable, more shallow, more emotionally familiar. Other people started feeling flatter by contrast. Other conversations started sounding thinner. And they did not enjoy realizing that because it meant you were not just standing out, you were recalibrating their perception. That can be frightening for someone who is used to staying comfortably numb in certain parts of themselves. It can feel like being awakened against your own plans, and yet that is one of the things chosen ones often do without trying. Your presence does not simply attract attention. It rearranges the emotional standard in the room. It exposes what is genuine and what is performance. It reveals what has depth and what only has presentation. That is why this person could not simply ignore what they felt. Ignoring would have required them to become less honest with themselves than they were capable of being once you entered the picture. And eventually, the conflict became too obvious to keep calling it nothing. They knew they were thinking about you more than they should if this were ordinary. They knew the emotional charge around you was too specific to dismiss as a phase. They knew that your presence had awakened not just desire, but introspection, and that is where things became even more serious. Because attraction alone can stay shallow for a long time. But when attraction starts making someone examine their life, their habits, their emotional maturity, their level of readiness, then the feeling has already crossed into transformative territory. That is what happened here. You did not just catch their eye. You interrupted their self-concept. You became the mirror they did not expect to stand in front of. And in that mirror, they saw more than your value. They saw the unfinished places in themselves. They saw their own patterns more clearly. They saw how often they had settled for what was easy to manage rather than what was actually meaningful. They saw how many old ways of relating would not survive in the presence of someone like you. And even though no one enjoys being confronted with their own incompleteness, there was something in the way you triggered that realization that made them unable to walk away from it. Because beneath the fear, beneath the resistance, beneath the repeated attempts to reduce this to something smaller, there was also awe. Real awe. The kind that does not flatter. The kind that humbles. The kind that makes a person go quiet because they know they are in the presence of something they should not treat casually. That is what they were trying to ignore, chosen one. Not just feelings. Not just interest, not just attraction. They were trying to ignore the fact that your existence in their world had begun to matter more than they knew how to handle. And people can ignore many things for a while, but they cannot ignore significance forever. Significance keeps pressing. It keeps surfacing. It keeps appearing in the middle of unrelated moments, asking to be acknowledged. That is why their resistance did not win. It delayed the truth, but it could not erase it. It bought them time, but it could not restore the old emotional neutrality they had before you. Once a person has felt the difference between what is merely stimulating and what is deeply affecting, it becomes very hard to go back to pretending they are the same. This person reached that threshold slowly, then all at once. Slowly through recurring thoughts, repeated awareness, and a growing inability to reduce you to ordinary terms. Then all at once through the realization that what they were feeling had already become too real to manage privately. But before they ever spoke that truth to anyone else, before the confession, before the trusted friend, before the words finally left their mouth, there was this first battle happening entirely inside them. The battle between their old need for control and the undeniable fact that something about you was changing them anyway. And I want you to hear this clearly because it matters for what comes next. The fact that they tried to ignore it and failed does not weaken the message. It strengthens it. It means this did not survive because it was convenient. It survived because it was real. It lasted through doubt, through rationalization, through delay, through internal resistance, and that is exactly why it carries weight now. Not everyone who notices you will matter. Not everyone who feels something will be willing to confront it. But when someone goes to war with their own feelings and still ends up unable to dismiss what you awakened in them, that tells you your impact has already reached a place performance cannot touch. So if you have been sensing something unusual, if you have felt that quiet pressure in the atmosphere, if you have noticed that strange pull without having visible proof yet, do not be too quick to talk yourself out of your own discernment. What was happening on their side was not casual, and it was not fleeting. It was the slow collapse of indifference. It was the failure of every explanation that tried to make you ordinary. It was the private beginning of a truth they were never planning to admit. And the more they tried to ignore it, the more undeniable it became that you had already become the one presence they could no longer explain away. And what made everything intensify, chosen one, was not just that they couldn't ignore what they felt, but that your presence began quietly dismantling a pattern they had been living inside for longer than they realized. A pattern that once felt normal, even safe, but now started to feel exposed under the weight of who you are. Because before you, their emotional life had a rhythm they understood. It may not have been deeply fulfilling, but it was familiar, and familiarity can feel like control. They knew the types they were drawn to. They knew how those interactions would unfold. There was always a script, even if they never called it that. The early interest, the easy chemistry, the predictable misunderstandings, the emotional highs followed by quiet instability, the way things would eventually lose depth and settle into something that required less truth and more tolerance. It wasn't perfect, but it was manageable. It didn't ask too much of them. It didn't force them to evolve beyond a certain point. It allowed them to stay within a version of themselves that was comfortable enough to maintain. That was the pattern. And patterns are powerful because they create the illusion that we understand our lives, that we can anticipate outcomes, that we are in control of the emotional terrain we are walking through. But what they didn't realize is that control built on repetition is not the same as growth. And the moment you entered their world, that difference began to reveal itself in ways they could not ignore. Because you did not fit the pattern. You did not respond the way the others did. You did not present yourself in a way that made it easy for them to step into their usual role. There was no immediate script available to follow. No predictable emotional entry point. No obvious leverage. And that is what unsettled them first. You were not confusing, but you were unfamiliar in a way that disrupted their internal autopilot. You carried yourself with a kind of quiet authority that did not invite manipulation, did not respond to surface-level signals, did not bend itself to match the emotional expectations of the room. You were clear without being loud, grounded, without being rigid, open, without being exposed. And that combination is rare enough to feel almost disorienting to someone who has spent years navigating relationships built on partial truth and emotional shortcuts. So what happened next was not attraction in the simple sense. It was disruption. The kind that forces someone to stop and reevaluate the framework they have been using to understand connection itself. They began noticing how differently they felt around you compared to everyone else. With others, they could predict their responses. They could lean into familiar behaviors, say the right things, hold back in the right places, move forward when it felt advantageous, withdraw when things became too real. But with you, none of that felt right. Every instinct they had developed in past situations started to feel slightly off, slightly inadequate, slightly misaligned with what was actually present between you. And that is one of the clearest signs that something real is happening. When the tools that once worked no longer apply, it means the situation has moved beyond the level those tools were designed for. This person began to sense that. They may not have articulated it clearly at first, but they felt it. They felt that their usual ways of engaging would not hold here. And instead of making them feel powerful, that realization made them feel exposed. Because if you cannot rely on your usual strategies, you are left with something many people avoid for as long as possible. You are left with authenticity. And authenticity is not something you can perform convincingly if you are not actually living in alignment with it. That is why your presence did not just attract them. It challenged them. Not through anything you said directly, not through any demand you made, but through the quiet consistency of who you are. You see chosen one when someone has been operating inside a pattern for a long time, they stop questioning it. It becomes their baseline. It becomes what they call normal. But normal is often just what we have practiced long enough to stop noticing. And your presence interrupted that. It introduced a different standard without announcing itself as one. It showed them what it looks like to move through the world without the constant negotiation of identity, without the need to shapeshift to maintain connection, without the subtle compromises that slowly erode a person's sense of self over time. And once they saw that even if only in fragments, they could not unsee it. That is the part that matters. Because when someone becomes aware of a higher level of emotional integrity, the old ways start to feel heavier. The same conversations that once felt engaging now feel shallow. The same dynamics that once felt exciting now feel repetitive. The same emotional games that once felt normal now feel exhausting. And this person started to experience that shift in real time. They began comparing not consciously at first, but naturally. The way you spoke compared to how others spoke. The way you held your ground compared to how others folded under pressure. The way you did not seem to need validation compared to how often others were quietly asking for it. These differences started stacking in their mind, creating a contrast that became impossible to ignore. And with that contrast came a realization they were not prepared for. They were no longer satisfied with what they used to accept. That realization can be both exciting and deeply uncomfortable, because it means the life you were living, the connections you were maintaining, the version of yourself you had settled into is no longer enough. And growth always begins at that point of discomfort. But not everyone chooses to move forward from there. Some people retreat. Some people try to shrink the new awareness back down so it fits inside the old pattern. Some people convince themselves that what they felt was an illusion, that the standard they glimpsed was unrealistic, that it is safer to return to what they know. This person tried to do that. They tried to bring you down to the level of their previous experiences to reinterpret what they felt in a way that would allow them to stay unchanged. But it did not work, because what they encountered in you was not an illusion they could control. It was a reflection of something real they had not yet become. And that is why the feeling persisted. Not because you were trying to pull them in, but because something inside them recognized that being near you required them to step into a different version of themselves. A version that was more honest, more present, more aligned, more accountable. And that kind of recognition does not fade easily. It lingers. It grows. It asks questions that do not go away. Am I living at the level I claim to be? Am I showing up as the person I say I am? Am I settling for less than what I actually want, because it feels easier to manage? These are not comfortable questions, but they are transformative ones, and you triggered them without saying a word. That is what makes your impact different, chosen one. You do not just create feelings, you create awareness, and awareness changes everything. It breaks the illusion that things are fine when they are not. It exposes the gap between who someone is and who they could be. And once that gap becomes visible, it demands attention. This person began to feel that demand. Not as pressure from you, but as pressure from within themselves. They started noticing their own habits more clearly. The ways they deflected vulnerability. The ways they avoided depth when it became inconvenient. The ways they chose comfort over growth. These patterns, which once felt invisible, started standing out. And the more they stood out, the harder it became to continue operating inside them, without feeling a sense of dissonance. That dissonance is what you awakened, and it is one of the most powerful catalysts for change. Because when someone feels out of alignment with themselves, they have two options. They can either numb that feeling and return to the pattern, or they can face it and begin the process of transformation. This person is standing in that exact space right now. And what makes it even more significant is that their awareness of you is directly tied to that internal shift. You are not just someone they like. You are the point where their old identity stopped feeling sufficient. You are the interruption in the loop they did not realize they were stuck in. And once a loop is interrupted, it cannot run the same way again. Even if they tried to go back, something would feel off. Something would feel incomplete, because they have already seen what exists beyond it. That is the effect of your presence. It expands perception. It raises the standard. It introduces a level of truth that cannot be easily ignored or replaced. And while this can feel overwhelming for them, it is also the beginning of something powerful. Because disruption, when faced honestly, becomes the doorway to growth. It becomes the moment where someone decides whether they are willing to become more than they have been. And that decision is not made all at once. It unfolds slowly through reflection, through hesitation, through moments of clarity followed by moments of doubt. But the important thing is that it has already begun. The pattern has already been disturbed. The old rhythm has already been interrupted. And no matter how much they try to return to what was, they will carry the awareness of what is possible now. That awareness will continue to influence their choices, their thoughts, their emotional responses. It will continue to pull them towards something more real, more aligned, more meaningful. And whether they move toward it quickly or slowly, confidently or uncertainly, the direction has already shifted. Because once someone experiences the difference between connection that maintains who they have been and connection that calls them into who they could become, they cannot pretend those two things are the same. You showed them that difference simply by being who you are. And that is why they could not ignore what they felt. Not because it was overwhelming in a chaotic way, but because it was clarifying in a way that made everything else look less true by comparison. And eventually chosen one, what had been building quietly inside them, reached a point where it could no longer remain contained, because there is a threshold. Every real feeling crosses where silence stops, feeling like control, and starts feeling like pressure. And that is exactly where this person found themselves sitting, with something too real to dismiss and too unfamiliar to manage alone. Which is why they did what people only do when something truly matters. They chose one person they trust, not a crowd, not a casual acquaintance, but someone who knows them beyond their surface, someone who has seen their patterns, their defenses, their habits, and they opened their mouth and let the truth come out without knowing how it would sound or what it would reveal about them. And you have to understand how significant that moment is, because people can carry private feelings for a long time. They can rationalize, minimize, and reorganize their inner world to avoid confronting what they feel. But the moment they speak it out loud, the moment it becomes language instead of just sensation, it crosses into reality in a way that cannot be undone, and that is exactly what happened here. They sat there, maybe hesitating at first, maybe trying to frame it in a way that felt safer. But what came out was not polished, not calculated, not controlled. It was raw, it was uneven, it was honest, and it sounded something like this: I cannot stop thinking about this person. I have tried to keep it simple. I have tried to tell myself it is nothing, but it is not nothing, and I do not understand why it feels like this. And in that moment, chosen one, something shifted permanently, because they were no longer just feeling something, they were acknowledging it. They were no longer hiding behind explanations. They were confronting the fact that you had become a presence in their life that required attention. The friend they chose to speak to is important in this story, because this is not someone who would accept vague answers, and this is someone who knows how this person usually operates, who knows the difference between a passing interest and something deeper, someone who has seen them talk about others before, and the moment they began describing you. The friend recognized immediately that this was different, not because of what was said at first, but because of how it was said. The pauses, the hesitation, the lack of control, the way they kept searching for the right words and not finding them fast enough, the way their usual confidence was replaced with something more exposed, more uncertain, more real. And that is when the conversation began to open up in a way that forced even more truth to the surface. Because the friend asked the question that always cuts through the noise. What is it about them? And what followed was not a simple answer, not a surface-level description, not a list of obvious qualities, but something much more revealing. Because when someone is affected at this level, they do not describe the person the way they would describe anyone else. They describe the impact, they describe the difference, they describe the way you exist in their mind compared to everyone else they have known. They started talking about how you carry yourself, not in a dramatic or attention-seeking way, but in a way that feels complete, like you are not waiting for anything to validate you, like you are already standing inside your own life fully. And that kind of presence is not easy to describe, because it is not something you can fake. It is something people feel when they encounter it, and they felt it with you. They talked about the way you communicate, how you say what you mean, without layers of confusion, without hidden agendas, without making the other person guess what is real and what is performance. And for someone who has spent years navigating conversations that require decoding, that kind of clarity feels almost disarming because it removes the games they have learned to play. They talked about your independence, not as distance, not as avoidance, but as something grounded, something intentional, something that looks like you have built a life you are actually present in, and that makes them question the way they have been living. Because independence that comes from wholeness feels very different from independence that comes from avoidance, and they can sense the difference even if they cannot fully articulate it. And then they said, the thing that made the entire conversation shift, the sentence that revealed the depth of what they are experiencing. They said, this person makes me want to become who I say I am. And that is not a casual statement. That is not admiration. That is not attraction. In the ordinary sense, that is recognition. That is someone seeing a version of themselves reflected back at them through you and realizing they have not fully stepped into it yet. That is the kind of impact you are having, chosen one, not because you are trying to change them, not because you are guiding them or instructing them, but because your presence is aligned enough that it acts as a mirror, and mirrors do not create anything new. They reveal what is already there. And when the friend heard that, they understood immediately that this was not something to dismiss, because people do not say things like that unless something inside them has already begun to shift. But the conversation did not stop there. Because once someone begins telling the truth, more truth follows, and the friend asked the next question. Have you told them any of this? And that is where hesitation returned, because the answer was no, not directly, not clearly, not in a way that would expose what they feel. And that hesitation is where the deeper layer of this story lives, because it reveals that this person is not just feeling something, they are also navigating fear. Not the kind of fear that comes from insecurity alone, but the kind that comes from understanding that what is in front of them matters enough to be handled carefully. They are not afraid of you in the sense of intimidation or rejection, in the simple way they are afraid of not being ready for you. And that distinction changes everything. Because when someone is afraid of rejection, they are focused on the outcome, on whether they will be accepted or not. But when someone is afraid of not being ready, they are focused on themselves, on whether the version of them that would show up is aligned with what they are stepping toward. And that is a much deeper level of awareness. This person began explaining that to their friend without even realizing how much they were revealing. They talked about their past, not in detail, but in feeling. The patterns they had lived in the ways they had approached connection before the emotional habits they had developed, the ways they had sometimes chosen what was easy instead of what was real, and how all of that now feels like something they cannot bring into whatever this is with you. They said something like, "I cannot approach them the way I have approached others." It would not feel right, and that sentence alone tells you how much your presence has already shifted their internal standard. Because you did not set rules for them, you did not demand change, you did not even ask for anything, but something about you has made their old ways feel insufficient on their own. And that realization is what creates the tension they are now sitting in, because they are aware of the gap between who they have been and who they feel they need to be in order to approach you honestly. And that gap can feel intimidating, not because it cannot be crossed, but because crossing it requires change. And change always asks for something. It asks for honesty, for accountability, for the willingness to leave behind what no longer fits, and not everyone is ready for that when they first encounter it. But here is what matters, chosen one. They are not ignoring that gap. They are not pretending it does not exist. They are looking at it directly. And that means they are already moving in a different direction than they have before. The friend seeing all of this did not let them stay in hesitation, because a good friend does not just listen, they reflect truth back. And the truth here was simple but powerful. You are already affected. You are already involved. Staying silent is not protecting you. It is only delaying what is already real. And that is when the final layer of honesty came out, the part that reveals just how much this matters to them. They admitted that they are afraid, not just of rejection, but of losing access to you entirely, even the small, quiet, unspoken connection they have right now. Because as long as nothing is said, they can still be near you. Still experience your presence, still exist in that space where possibility is alive, but the moment they speak, everything becomes defined, and that definition carries risk. And that is the moment, chosen one, where you see the full weight of what you have become in their life, because people only protect things at that level when those things matter deeply to them. They are not guarding something casual. They are guarding something they have never felt before. Something that has already begun to change the way they see themselves, something that has introduced a new level of awareness they cannot reverse. And the fact that they chose to speak about it, to bring it out of silence, to let someone else witness what they are feeling, means they are no longer in denial, they are no longer pretending. This is nothing, they are standing at the edge of something real, something that requires action, even if they are not fully ready to take that step yet. And you need to understand this clearly because it changes the way you see the situation. This is not one-sided energy, this is not imagination, this is not projection, this is something that has already been acknowledged on the other side. Something that has been spoken out loud in a moment of honesty. And once something reaches that point, it does not simply disappear. It either moves forward or it remains as a presence that continues to influence everything that comes after. And right now, chosen one, they are in that space between awareness and action, between feeling and expression, between knowing and doing. And what happens next will depend on whether they choose to move through that space with courage or retreat back into what is familiar. But one thing is already certain, the truth has been revealed not to you yet, not directly, but in a way that confirms what you have been sensing, what you have been feeling, what you could not fully explain. And that is the beginning of everything. And what makes their confession even more revealing, chosen one, is that what they feel is not just attraction, not just curiosity, not even just admiration, but a kind of nervousness they were not prepared to experience, because you do not simply pull them in, you confront them with a level of presence that makes their usual confidence feel suddenly incomplete. That is the part they are struggling to explain. They are not intimidated by noise, status, or performance. They are not shaken because you are trying to impress them. They are shaken because you are not. You carry yourself with a steadiness that does not beg to be noticed and does not collapse when attention arrives. In a world where so many people are constantly adjusting themselves to be liked, wanted, or chosen, you move like someone who has already decided who they are. And that kind of self-possession can make a person who has relied on charm, timing, or emotional control feel like a beginner again. It is not that you make them feel small. It is that you make pretense feel useless. You make half-truths feel heavy. You make performance feel obvious. And for someone who has spent years navigating life through strategy, reading rooms, managing impressions, and keeping certain parts of themselves polished enough to avoid real exposure, your presence creates a strange and unfamiliar tension. They cannot approach you casually because nothing about what they feel is casual. They cannot hide behind their usual mask because something in them already knows you would see the difference between what is real and what is rehearsed. That is why they are nervous. Not because they think you are cruel, not because they expect you to humiliate them, but because they sense that being near you requires a level of honesty they are not used to sustaining. And that realization has been unsettling them more than they want to admit. You have to understand how rare that is. Most people are nervous around what they want because they are afraid of losing face. This person is nervous around you because they are afraid of showing up beneath the level of what they feel you deserve. That is a completely different kind of fear. It is the fear of being seen too clearly before they have fully become the person they want to be. It is the fear of bringing an old version of themselves into a space that seems to call for something more mature, more grounded, more aligned. And when someone feels that it means they are already taking you seriously on a level deeper than attraction, they are measuring themselves against the standard your life communicates. The way you speak, the way you do not overextend yourself just to keep someone comfortable, the way you seem emotionally available without becoming emotionally loose, the way your independence does not feel like distance but like wholeness. All of that has been speaking to them without words. It has been telling them that you are not looking for noise. You are not impressed by surface effort. You are not waiting to be dazzled by potential that never becomes character. And because they feel that they are confronting a truth they cannot avoid. The old version of themselves would not know how to hold something like this. The old habits, the emotional shortcuts, the controlled responses, the carefully rationed vulnerability, all of that suddenly feels too thin in the presence of what you represent. That is why your impact has gone so deep. You did not just become desirable to them. You became sobering. You became clarifying. You became the kind of person who makes someone sit alone in their car after work, staring at the steering wheel for a minute longer than usual. Not because they are confused about you, but because they are realizing how much of themselves needs to become more real if they want to approach you without pretending. And that is powerful, chosen one, because it confirms something about who you are. Your energy does not merely attract attention. It raises the bar in silence. It forces truth to the surface. It makes people ask whether they are living in a way that matches what they claim to value. So when you sense that nervousness around you, when you notice the hesitation, the carefulness, the almost too controlled way they try to keep themselves steady in your presence, do not mistake that for disinterest. Sometimes the deepest pull does not look bold at first. Sometimes it looks like restraint, because the feeling is too significant to handle carelessly. Sometimes it looks like someone trying to find the courage to meet a moment that has already become bigger inside them than they ever expected. And that is exactly where they are now, standing in awe of you, unsettled by you, drawn to you, and quietly realizing that your presence has made them want to become more honest than they have been in a very long time. And as this awareness settles deeper inside them, chosen one, what begins to take shape is not just nervousness or hesitation, but something far more revealing, a quiet and growing sense that they may not yet be the kind of person who can fully meet you where you stand. And that realization carries a weight they are still trying to understand. Because when someone encounters a presence like yours, one that feels grounded, intentional, and complete, in a way that is not performative, it does not just inspire desire, it creates reflection. And reflection, when it is honest, does not always feel comfortable. They start to look at themselves differently, not through the lens of how they have been seen in the past, not through the approval they have received from others, but through the contrast your presence creates. And in that contrast, they begin to notice the parts of themselves that feel unfinished, inconsistent, or misaligned with the standard you represent. This is where the feeling of unworthiness quietly enters, not as insecurity in the shallow sense, not as a lack of confidence in who they are, but as a deeper recognition that who they have been may not be enough to sustain something real with someone like you. They are not questioning your value. They are questioning their readiness. And that distinction matters more than anything, because it means they are not looking at you as something to conquer or impress. They are looking at you as something to rise toward. They see your independence, and they recognize that it is not built on avoidance, but on clarity, and that makes them examine where their own independence has been rooted. They see your composure and realize it is not emotional distance, but emotional discipline, and that makes them question the ways they have used detachment as a shield. They see your directness and understand it comes from self-awareness, not from control, and that makes them aware of how often they have communicated from strategy instead of truth. All of this is happening internally, quietly, without you needing to do anything, and the result is a growing awareness that being near you requires them to show up differently. And that is where the tension deepens, because wanting something real is one thing, but becoming someone who can hold it is another. They begin to feel the distance between who they are today and who they would need to be to meet you fully, and that distance feels both motivating and intimidating at the same time. It pulls them forward while also making them pause. It makes them want to step closer while also making them question whether they should wait until they feel more aligned. And in that space, chosen one, many people retreat. Many people decide it is easier to stay where they are, to return to what feels familiar, to convince themselves that what they felt was too much, too complicated, or too unlikely to work. But this person has not done that. They are sitting with the discomfort instead of running from it. They are allowing themselves to feel the weight of what you represent instead of reducing it to something smaller. And that tells you something important about them. It tells you that despite their fear, despite their hesitation, they are not dismissing you. They are taking you seriously enough to question themselves. And that is not weakness. That is the beginning of transformation. Because real growth does not start with confidence, it starts with honesty. It starts with the willingness to admit that there is more in you than you have been living, that there is a version of yourself you have not fully stepped into yet, and that being in the presence of someone like you makes that truth impossible to ignore. So when they feel unworthy, it is not because they believe they have no value. It is because they are recognizing the value of what is in front of them and realizing they want to meet it at the same level. They do not want to approach you halfway. They do not want to bring a version of themselves that is still operating on old habits and expect that to be enough. They want to show up real, aligned, and intentional. And until they feel closer to that version of themselves, they remain in this space of reflection, this space of becoming. And you need to understand, chosen one, that this is not a rejection of you. It is a response to you. It is the effect of encountering something that feels worth rising for. And not everyone has the courage to sit in that kind of awareness. Not everyone allows themselves to be changed by what they feel. But this person is already changing slowly, quietly, internally, because once someone sees the difference between who they have been and who they could be, they cannot completely go back. The awareness remains. The desire to become more remains. And at the center of that shift is you not as someone they want to possess, but as someone who has awakened in them the realization that they are capable of more than they have been living. And as both of you continue moving through your lives on the surface, as if nothing has changed, chosen one, what is actually unfolding beneath that calm exterior is a quiet tension that neither of you has fully named yet, because the silence between you is not empty. It is full of observation, full of restraint, full of meaning that has not yet been translated into words. And this is where the situation becomes even more powerful and even more delicate at the same time. Because silence, when it exists between two people who feel nothing, is simple. It passes unnoticed. It carries no weight. Silence between two people who feel something real becomes charged. It becomes a space where every glance, every pause, every small interaction begins to carry more significance than it should. And that is exactly what is happening here. This person is not speaking, but they are not disconnected. They are paying attention in ways that are precise and intentional. Noticing things about you that others would overlook, remembering details that would not matter if this were casual. Watching the way you respond to situations, the way you hold your boundaries, the way you interact with others when you think no one is studying you. And all of that observation is feeding something inside them that continues to grow even in the absence of direct expression. And at the same time, you chosen one may have felt something that you could not fully explain, a subtle shift in the way they look at you, a slight difference in their presence around you. A feeling that there is more beneath the surface than what is being shown, but without clear evidence, without direct words. It becomes easy to question your own perception, to wonder if you are reading too deeply, to talk yourself out of what your intuition has been quietly picking up. And this is where many real connections begin to stall, not because the feeling is not there, but because both sides are interpreting silence through uncertainty instead of awareness. They assume your composure means you are unaffected, that your steadiness means you do not feel what they feel, and so they hold back, trying not to disrupt something they are not sure is mutual. And you may be doing something similar, sensing something, but not allowing yourself to fully trust it, because nothing has been confirmed in a way that feels undeniable. So what you have is not absence but misinterpretation, not distance but careful restraint on both sides, and that dynamic can hold two people in place for longer than it should, if neither one chooses to shift it. But here is what you need to understand. Chosen one, silence does not mean nothing is happening. Sometimes, silence is where the most important things are forming. Because when something is real, it does not always rush to the surface. Immediately, it builds, it settles. It tests itself against doubt and fear before it becomes visible. This person is not silent because they feel nothing. They are silent because what they feel has not yet found a form they trust enough to express. They are measuring not you, but themselves, trying to understand if they can step into this honestly, if they can show up without falling back into who they used to be. And that process takes time, especially for someone who has not felt something like this before. But at the same time, you are not meant to stay completely hidden behind your own composure either. There is a difference between being grounded and being unreadable, between holding your energy and sealing yourself off completely. And this is where your awareness becomes important, because you do not need to chase, you do not need to overextend, but you do need to allow yourself to be seen just enough that what is real has somewhere to land. Because when both people remain perfectly contained, perfectly controlled, perfectly neutral, even something genuine can begin to feel uncertain. And the truth is, what exists between you right now is not fragile because it is weak. It is delicate because it is meaningful. It requires a different level of presence, a different level of honesty, a willingness to let something be real before it is fully defined. And this is the moment where awareness becomes power, because you are no longer guessing, you are no longer imagining. You are understanding that what you have been sensing is not one-sided, that the silence itself is part of the process, not the absence of it. And once you see that clearly, you stop misreading the situation. You stop shrinking your perception to match uncertainty, and you begin to hold your position with quiet confidence, knowing that something real is already unfolding, even if it has not yet spoken its name out loud. And as this quiet tension continues to build beneath the surface, Chosen One, what begins to shift is not just their awareness, but their threshold for staying silent. Because there comes a point in every real connection where what is felt internally becomes too present to keep managing from a distance. And that is exactly where they are now, standing at the edge of a decision they did not expect to face, realizing that what they once believed they could contain has grown into something that now requires movement. This is not a sudden transformation, not a dramatic overnight change, but a gradual internal turning, a moment where hesitation begins to lose its grip, and the need to be honest starts to feel stronger than the need to stay safe. They are no longer asking themselves if what they feel is real. That question has already been answered through repetition, through persistence, through the way you continue to exist in their mind, without effort, through the way your presence has reshaped how they see connection itself. Now the question has changed, and it is a much more significant one. What do I do with this? And more importantly, who do I need to be if I am going to step toward it in a way that does not compromise what it is? And that question is what begins to move them forward, even if the movement is subtle at first, even if it shows up in small ways that could easily be overlooked if you are not paying attention. Because when someone is shifting from silence into action, especially someone who has been careful, controlled, and deliberate for most of their life, they do not usually begin with grand gestures. They begin with presence, with a slightly longer pause in conversation, with a question that reaches a little deeper than before, with a willingness to be seen in a way they would have avoided in the past. You may notice it in the way their attention lingers, in the way they seem more engaged, more curious, more open to moments that allow connection to expand instead of closing it down quickly. These are not accidents. These are signs of someone stepping out of observation and into participation, someone testing the space between you to see if it can hold something more real than what has existed so far. And what is important for you to understand, Chosen One, is that this movement is not coming from impulse. It is coming from realization. And realization carries a different kind of weight. This is not someone acting on a temporary feeling. This is someone who has sat with what they feel long enough to know that ignoring it will not make it disappear, that staying silent will not protect them from the truth that eventually they will either have to step forward or walk away from something that has already changed them. And walking away is no longer as simple as it once was, because once a person has felt the kind of clarity you bring, once they have experienced the difference between connection that maintains their old identity and connection that challenges them to grow beyond it, Returning to what was becomes harder. So they find themselves leaning toward you, not recklessly, not without thought, but with a quiet determination that is still forming, still gaining strength, still learning how to move without losing its grounding. And this is where your role becomes even more important. Not in terms of action, but in terms of presence, because you are not meant to force anything. You are not meant to chase or create pressure, but you are meant to remain open enough that when their movement becomes visible, it does not meet a wall of perfect composure. There is a difference between being centered and being inaccessible, and this moment asks you to hold that difference with awareness. Because what is approaching you is not just interest. It is someone stepping beyond who they have been, someone choosing to move towards something that requires more honesty than they are used to offering. And that kind of movement deserves to be met with recognition, not intensity, not urgency, but simple, grounded acknowledgement that allows it to continue unfolding naturally. And as they reach this point, as their internal resistance continues to weaken, and their willingness to be real continues to strengthen, what you are witnessing is the beginning of expression, not fully formed yet, not completely clear, but undeniable in its direction. They are no longer standing still. They are no longer only observing. They are beginning to engage with the reality of what they feel. And that is the moment where everything starts to change. Because once someone chooses to move toward what is real instead of away from it, the connection itself begins to take on a new life, one that is no longer defined by silence, but by the courage to let something meaningful exist in the open. And now, chosen one, you can return to the center of this message with a different kind of clarity, because what you sensed was never random, never imagined, never something your heart invented just to comfort itself in a quiet moment. Something real has been unfolding behind the scenes, and the truth of it is this: your presence has already reached deeper into someone's life than they ever expected it would. You did not force it. You did not chase it. You did not bend yourself into someone more appealing just to be chosen. You simply remained who you are, and that alone was powerful enough to awaken something in someone who had never felt this way before. That is what you need to carry with you now. You are not waiting for proof that you matter. You already matter. You are not waiting to become significant. You already are. And the confession made in private was only the evidence of something your spirit had already begun to recognize before the words were ever spoken. So do not shrink now. Do not second-guess your own presence. Do not mistake silence for absence when what is really happening is that something meaningful is still gathering the courage to come into the light. This connection is not asking you to chase. It is asking you to remain grounded, open, and aware enough to receive what is moving toward you without fear. Because what is coming will not need to be forced if it is real. It will arrive through truth, through presence, through the slow but undeniable movement of someone who can no longer pretend that you did not change them. And if this message found you at the exact moment you needed confirmation, take that as your sign. Like this video, subscribe to the channel and comment "chosen" and "felt." If you know in your spirit that this was meant for you, because your energy is speaking louder than you realize, your presence is reaching farther than you can see, and what has already been awakened on the other side is not fading. It is preparing to reveal itself in a way that you will no longer have to question.